Hello everyone, we have a new pattern to make today. This is going to be a full complete tutorial. The pattern at the time that I'm recording this has not been released yet, and I've been given permission by the pattern designer to make this. If you found the link for this video via the pattern, yay, you already have it. If not, there's a link for the pattern where you can get the pattern in the description box below. So this is the Kelley Hexagonal Trio pouch pattern, and I'll show you the three that I've already made. So this is the large one. It's a nice size pouch, very roomy inside. It has a large slip pocket as well as a zipper pocket inside. It attaches to a crossbody strap via these two D-rings. So the mid-size pouch here has a D-ring connector on the side, and it also has the zipper pocket in the lining. The small pouch, which I have added a key fob hardware to, I just added it right to it after it was made, is really roomy, be nice for a small change pouch. So I'm going to be making the large one today, since it has pretty much all the bells and whistles. So let's get right down to it. You're going to need your 4 bottom panels, 2 for the front and 2 for the back. Your 4 upper panels, for the 2 for the front and 2 for the back for the exterior. You can use 2 different materials. You can use all the same material. You can use 4 different if you'd like. Your 2 lining pieces, your slip pocket piece, your zipper pocket pieces, your 2 zipper pieces, 2 zipper tabs. That one is for the exterior zipper. This is going to be for my D-ring connectors, and then of course all of your hardware, your D-rings, your swivel clasps. Now I'm going to be using for this particular bag a webbing, but there are instructions for a completed vinyl or fabric strap within the pattern. So I'm going to do my best to go step by step according to the pattern directions. I will not be giving you any measurements or showing you the pattern pieces in this video. You can find all of that when you purchase the pattern. So let's get started. So the first part in the process is to prepare your pattern pieces. Now, if you're using a good quality vinyl on the outside, you don't need to worry about interfacing or anything like that. If it's a lighter weight vinyl, you may want to interface that. If you're using woven material, what I've done is I have a layer of a woven interfacing and a layer of Decavil light on these to give it approximately the same amount of structure that my vinyl has. So you want to think about that when you're preparing your pieces once you have everything cut out. Now, I don't need to interface my lining pieces because I'm using a waterproof canvas, but if you're using a woven, then you're going to want to interface with probably something like an SF101, a woven interfacing. So I have a woven on this, and then on 1/2 of it, I also put a layer of Decavil light to give the pocket a good bit of structure. Also, if you're using a directional fabric, make sure that you think about the direction that your fabric goes. So for the upper piece, to make sure that my fabric is going the correct way, I've used the top of it because that top is going to be level. For the lower piece, I've used the bottom. You don't want to use this top edge because that edge is going to be on an angle on the bag itself. Same goes with this one. You don't want to use the bottom edge because then your fabric is not going to be straight. So let's get into sewing. So for the first steps in actually attaching the pieces in your pattern, we're going to do the exterior panels first. So I find it easy to lay out my pieces the way they're going to be on the bag, and you can see they're the same. So when the bag is put together, they're going to be opposite, which I kind of like. You can do it the other way around if you'd like, but think about that when you're cutting out your pieces. Think about the layout and where they're going to go, and make sure that when you're cutting out the other side, you're going to use the same pattern piece, but you're going to reverse it. So you're going to cut out, if you're doing a piece like mine here, where you have opposites with 2 materials, you're going to make sure that this piece is cut both on one side and the reverse, as well as this piece, twice for each one to get both sides of the bag. I hope that makes sense. So now we're going to start sewing. So the first part we're going to sew is the center seam across the front. So we're going to pop all these pieces down and line those edges up and clip them, and then we're going to go over to the machine and sew them together. Okay, now we're over at the machine and we're going to stitch along this edge at 1/4 of an inch for all 4 pieces. Okay, so all 4 of these pieces are sewn across at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now the thing we need to do is set our machine to a top stitching length, and we're going to open up this seam and top stitch down both sides at 1/8 of an inch. So what I like to do is lay it flat and just finger press the seam open before I get into actually top stitching. That way the seam is more likely to stay open as you're going. And you may need to, lift it up and adjust as you go, and that's perfectly all right. I am going to backstitch 1 stitch at the beginning and end because that's going to be within the seam allowance. I recommend really taking your time when you're top stitching. And I've been asked before how I get my top stitching straight without using any sort of an edge foot or anything like that. Is don't watch where your needle is. Watch in front of your needle or in front of your presser foot and keep that presser foot lined up where you want it with the edge of that seam. And that is really going to help you keep it lined up. That and take your time. It's not a race. And the slower you go to make sure that you are on line with where you want it to be, the nicer it's going to come out. So I'm at the end of this one. I'm going to lift my needle up, just spin it around, and go right back down the other side. And I'm going to do the same to all 3 other pieces. So this is what each one is going to look like. You're going to have top stitching above and below that seam. And you should have a nice flat piece. Okay, so now we have our left and our right sides sewn together, top and bottom. Now we need to match them up, making sure it's very important that this is the first point you match up. Match up the seams so that they are nice and even, and we're going to put a clip right there. And then we'll match up the top and bottom. Now, if they don't match perfectly, it's not that big a deal. It can be straightened up when we do the final seams. So we're going to match the left and right and clip those together, and then we're going to do the exact same thing that we just did with the sides. We're going to sew at 1/4 of an inch, open it up, spread the seam, and then top stitch down both sides. Also, make sure you reset your stitch length down to a structured stitch length. And backstitch at the beginning of it and end. Okay, now that our exterior panels are completed, we're going to set these aside and move on to working on our lining. As a side note, if you're going to add your logo hardware to the exterior of your bag, this is a good time to do that. I've placed mine on the upper portion about an inch up from this point where all four pieces meet that are lined up with the center line so that it is squared up with that. You can put it wherever you want. If you put it on the bottom part, keep in mind that this area down here is going to be underneath the bottom of the bag, so you want to measure from where the fold area is going to be. So that part is on the bottom. You're going to measure from here and maybe put it in there somewhere. So consider the size of your label and where exactly you'd like for it to sit. So I've done that. So the next thing we're going to do is put in our lining zipper pocket. So I've already got my zipper pull on my section of zipper tape, and I'm using a number 5 zipper tape because that's typically what I use on everything. If you have number 3, use number 3. That's great. So you're going to put a box on the back of your main panel according to the pattern directions. So I'm not going to give you the measurements. Those are in the pattern. I normally do my welt pockets differently, but for the sake of the pattern, I'm going to do it following the pattern. That way anybody who hasn't done one before can easily do that. I will put a card up in the corner that will take you to the video that I made on how I do the alternate welt pocket method. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and line these up. Finding the center is going to be a good thing. And I'm eyeballing it. You'll probably want to measure it to make sure that it is spot on. I'll pin it from this side. I'm just going to put a pin here, and it's not going to wiggle too much. You know what, I'm going to put a second one in. So make sure that the pins are far enough down that they are out of the way of where you're going to be sewing around the box that you drew. So we'll go over to the machine with all these pieces and proceed to complete the zipper pocket. So for this step, we're going to take the pieces that we've pinned together and we're going to sew a box. We're going to sew around the box that we drew here, just along the outside lines, ignoring this center line and the little triangle in the corner. So we're going to go over, down, over, and up. Okay, now we can trim our threads and remove our pins. You can see here that we have a box sewn all the way around. Now we're going to go back over to the cutting counter, and I have my iron ready to go so that we can proceed with the next steps. So I'm just going to push my mat out of the way here. And I'm going to go ahead and cut open this slot. This is where our zipper face is going to be. So I have a couple of pairs of scissors, and I'm also going to be using my rotary cutter. You can use scissors for the whole thing, however you like to do it. Just make sure that you don't cut all the way to the stitches. So now we've cut open up to where the triangle is, and from there we're going to go up to the corner, being careful not to cut the stitches in the corner because that would defeat the purpose. It'll just unravel. So you want to be careful there. I'm going to do that on both sides. Now this part's the fun part. So we're going to take that pocket and push it through to the other side. And at this point, I'm going to finger press my seams. Just to kind of push them back open. And you can use a seam roller or a brayer. I actually have a brayer that I'm going to be using. So take your time with this. It can be a little fiddly. Sometimes the corners want to get a little, but with a little bit of time and patience, you can work all that out. I'm almost positive, because I didn't go back and look at the pattern, that I placed my panel, my lining panel, a little too far down, but that's okay. I can still make it work. See, it's a good thing that I didn't give measurements, isn't it? It's a make it work situation, but that's okay. So I will iron this, but I'm going to iron it from the other side. And it's trying to be a little tricky, especially considering I cut it too short there. You can use double-sided adhesive to hold things back out of the way if you choose to do that. And that would work as well. But I'm going to give this a quick press. Making sure that seam is turned back. You want to be careful if you're using waterproof canvas like I am, because it will melt. Sometimes I don't iron it at all when I do this, because it heats it up and it wants to go its own way. I'm actually probably going to use a piece of double-sided adhesive on the back of that just to keep it out of the way. And then I will meet you back over the machine to add the zipper. Alright, so I added a bit of double-sided tape just to the seam allowance so that I could attach this. You don't want to attach it to the body of the lining itself, because then it will be harder to attach the other panel, unless you don't put it in the wrong place like I did. So now I'm going to run a piece of double-sided adhesive across the top and the bottom. I'm not really worried about the sides. Just above that seam. And that is what is going to hold our zipper in place while we are sewing around the pocket. So one thing I like to do with my zipper, because wherever this pull is, there's going to be a lump. You can see how there's a change in elevation of the tape there. So I like to have the pull where it's going to be when the pocket is closed. That way you don't have to worry about any lumps along this tape, and it's going to be a nice straight zipper. So I'm going to lay that on my surface like so, and peel off the backing to one side, not both sides, just one side. And I usually like to start with the top. Make sure that your pull is on the left. And then you're just going to center that while holding the sides back out of the way. You're going to center that right over the zipper. And make sure that your tape stays nice and straight. So once you have the top secured, then you can pull this up and peel off the bottom. And then line that up. Make sure that your pull is back out of the way. And usually all it takes is just laying that down and making sure that it's not sagging in the middle. Finger press it down, and now we're going to top stitch all the way around this opening. And that is going to further secure everything in place. I like to start on the bottom side, close to the pull. I'm stitching 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the opening. So from the edge, not from the teeth. We're actually approximately 1/4 of an inch away from the teeth in my case. It may be a little bit different for you if you're using a number 3, but I've adjusted my opening and everything for number 5 zipper. So I'm going to slide that out of the way and take one more stitch right there to get past the end. Move that pull back up there, and I'm going to go ahead and clip this thread tail just so that it's not in my way. I don't accidentally sew over it. One stitch. You can see I am secured to the back, top stitched all the way around, and now I'm going to add the back panel. So I'm going to take this panel and place it right side down against the other lining, pocket lining panel, and that's going to put the two pieces right sides together. I'm just going to line those up and put a couple of clips around it. And now I'm going to clip it so that the clip is facing my exterior or my lining piece itself rather than facing up where I would be looking at the top of it. That way when I sew it, it'll be easier to remove the clips. I'm just going to put a couple of clips there. I'm going to flip this over so that it is right sides up. And then I'm going to start on one side and I'm going to sew down to the bottom, turn, go across, turn again, go up the other side, and then turn and carefully go across above the pocket. And that's going to secure the pocket lining of the interior of the bag. Our zipper pocket is complete in the lining panel, and that is what the back will look like. So now we're going to go over to the counter and get our slip pocket ready to attach to the other side. All right, so for this step we're going to need the other lining panel and our slip pocket panel. So we're going to start with the slip pocket panel. And again, I explained why there's a layer of Decovil as well as a layer of the woven materials. Just I want a little bit more structure. That and the fact that I am using an industrial machine. If you're using a domestic machine, don't even worry about that. But with my industrial machine, it tends to not like lighter weight fabrics. It wants that heavy stuff. Otherwise, the tension just goes all to pots and it can rip through the fabric. So I like to add that extra little bit. So I'm going to bring this down and match up the edge. And then I'm going to sew around, but I'm leaving a gap at the bottom so that I can turn the pocket through. So let's go over to the machine and take care of that. I'm going to pop a couple of clips on this just to make sure that it's staying nice and even, because I have that Decovil light just on the fold, and it's secured pretty well, so it's wanting to pull back. So I'm going to clip this just so that it stays right where I want it. So now I'm going to sew it with the Decovil light side up because I'm going to sew right along that edge. So make sure you stop and backstitch, and then I'm not even gonna bother cutting the thread. I'm just gonna move this forward, drop my needle down where I want to start again, do a couple of stitches, backstitch again, and then go on around to the rest of the panel. let's head back over to the counter and get this ready to put onto the lining panel. Okay, so we're going to need our iron again for this step because I do like to iron it nice and smooth. So I'm going to set that aside for just a moment, and we need to make sure that we're clipping our corners before we turn. So I like to clip about just over a 1/16 of an inch away from the top corners. And then again on the bottom, I tend to not cut straight across. I give it a little bit of an angle. There we go. And you can see here how that is not straight across. It has that little bit of an angle there. And that's just going to give the fabric a little more room in that corner. I'm not even going to worry about trimming these threads. So I'm going to push the corners out as far as I can with my fingers. And then I'm going to use a tool to push them the rest of the way out. And I like to use a bone folder. This is a Cricut one. I also have this one. This is one of my bookbinding tools. And it has a little bit more of a blunt edge. So if you're using vinyl or something like that, this one is great. But because this is a woven material, I'm going to go ahead and use this one. And just be really careful not to poke it through the material. One thing that's great about using that Decaville light and sewing just along the edge of it is it's a lot easier to get a nice crisp corner. All right, there we go. So now I'm ready to press that. And I'm going to start from the folded edge. Now, I want to make sure that this is pressed out completely and that these edges are folded in nicely. And I'm going to fold it in right up against that Decaville on the side that the Decaville is on. And the other side I'm going to line up with that as I fold it. And then once this is folded, we're going to go over, well, once it's folded and pressed, we're going to go over and top stitch across the folded edge of the pocket, not across the edge where the opening is. That opening will get closed up when the pocket gets attached to the lining panel. There we go. So we're going to go over and top stitch across that top edge. Now we want to consider our material and which way it's facing. So if I top stitched across this side, it would be upside down because my pocket is going to be laying this way in the bag itself. So I want to make sure that this side is facing up when I top stitch. Okay, now I have top stitched across the top of that. My pocket's laying nice and flat. So now I'm going to place the pocket centered on the lining panel according to the pattern direction. Now that I have this where I want it, I am going to go ahead and just tuck a pin on each side. I'm not even going to try to maneuver it so that it's poking down and back up. I just want it to not move when I start sewing. So let's go back over to the machine and get this pocket attached. So for this part, you're going to sew down the side 1/8 of an inch from the edge across the bottom, and as you sew across the bottom, it's going to close up that opening, and then back up the other side, making sure that you back stitch at the beginning and end. And there we go. Our slip pocket is attached. I'm going to go ahead and trim this little thread right here. And we're good to move on to the next step. So this is the point in the pattern where you're going to prepare your D-ring connectors as well as your zipper. So listed in the pattern in order, first is your D-rings and then your zipper. So I've already added my zipper pull, so we're going to go over to the machine and take care of these two steps. Now I will say that I have put a piece of Decaville down the middle of my vinyl. And the reason being is because this particular vinyl has a little bit of stretch to it. And I don't want that in my D-ring connector. There's going to be weight on it, and that gives the potential for the area where it's sewn into the bag to perforate and rip. And if you have this piece of Decaville or another stabilizer in there, it shouldn't do that. So I will say that that is something that I've already done. And I have it centered just the right size for this particular strap. So what I'm going to be doing is folding this in and top stitching down both sides. The only deviation that I'm making from the pattern is I'm using 1 inch instead of half inch, or instead of 3/4 inch hardware, because I just don't buy it. I only use 1 inch and half inch typically, and mostly 1 inch. So I'm going to be doing that. And then I also have my zipper tabs to add to my zipper. And let's go to the machine and take care of that. I also have my double-sided adhesive here because when working on this piece, let me just set this aside, I'm actually going to fold this in and stick it down with a double-sided adhesive. So I'm going to run 2 pieces just on either side of the center. I like to start from the middle, and one way to keep it from bending or curving when you do even straps is when you're folding the side in, make sure that you're going directly from the edge to the center and you're not pulling this, because again, this particular vinyl has a stretch, so it may look like there's a lump there, but that's going to smooth out when I press everything down. Here we go. So there's one side, we'll do the other side, and then I'm going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge. If you're using a woven material, you're more than welcome to go ahead and do a double fold. But for vinyl, I'm okay to have the raw edges on the inside meeting. No one is ever going to know that they are there. So I'm going to go over to my counter really quick and cut this in half, and then we'll come in and add the D-rings to it. Alright, so I have my 2 separate pieces here, and I'm going to thread it onto my D-ring with the back side where the raw edges meet, facing the bar. I'm going to fold that in half with the edges matching, and then I'm just going to baste right across the end. I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. So that has our D-ring connectors ready to add to the bag. Now let's move on to our zipper tabs. So I'm going to lay this with the sides matching, and I'm actually going to add a clip to each side away from the edge. And I'm doing this with the right side of the vinyl facing the zipper teeth. I'm going to do the same thing on the other edge. Now my zipper ends, my tabs are smaller than what the pattern calls for because I go rogue and I just prefer it this way. Now I'm going to stitch across at 1/4 of an inch away from the edge using a regular stitch length. Back stitching at the beginning and the end. I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. Now for the version in the pattern, you're going to be folding this in and then around to the back so that there's no raw edge on the back of the zipper. I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just folding it up and around the back because I don't mind that raw edge of the vinyl. It's not going to fray or anything like that. So I just make sure everything is lined up. You can even add a piece of double-sided tape to the back of this so that it stays in place. And I'm actually going to do that this time, just so I have some nice even zipper tabs. I'm going to do the same thing to the other end. So I'm going to bring that around and press it in place. So now I'm going to top stitch across there about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and that is going to catch the back so that it's not going to pop loose. There we go. Now we're ready to go on with the assembly of the body of the bag. So I'll meet you over at the counter. Okay, so to start assembly of the body of the bag, so I'm going to need the front panel, the slip pocket panel. I'm going to set the other two panels aside. So I'm lining everything up on my grid mat, and I'm going to find the center of my zipper by folding it in half and just giving a little crimp right there. And then I can line that up on my mat, still making sure that that is centered. Now I'm going to use my chalk runner just to put a little bit of chalk right there on that center line. I also want to make sure that my zipper pull is on the left side. So now I'm going to run double-sided adhesive right across here. Okay, so I'm going to line up my panel along my grid mat and remove the backing of my adhesive. Now I'm lining it up with this line, the center line, not with the bottom or the top edge because they may not be quite even. So I want that center line to be as vertical as possible. So now I'm going to line up the center of my zipper where I've made that mark right with that center line, and then I'm going to press it in place, making sure not to stretch it as I'm going. Stretching the zipper gives you a wonky zipper. We don't want wonky zippers. I'm making sure I'm right on the edge. There we go. I'm going to take the lining piece and place it face down right on top of that. Lining that center mark up with the center mark on my pole or on my zipper. And then I'm just going to press in place all the way across from the center out. And then we're going to go over to the machine and stitch across. So now for the front panel, because my zipper is already down here closed on the left, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to sew it from the exterior side. Make sure it's your back stitching at the beginning and end. And you're going to sew yours according to the pattern directions. This is another one of those little areas that I tend to go rogue. So I'm going to stop here, lift and pull my zipper out of the way so that I can make sure that my panels are still lined up nicely here. And then here's another part where I deviate from the pattern. The way the pattern calls for is you're going to open up the two pieces and fold them away from the zipper, and you're going to top stitch through the exterior and the lining from zipper tab to zipper tab. The reason for doing that is so that your lining doesn't get caught in your zipper. So because I'm using waterproof canvas for mine and it doesn't tend to get caught in zippers, I'm not going to sew to top stitch through the lining. I'm only going to top stitch through the exterior of the material. So it's going through the exterior and through the seam allowance. Okay, there we go. So now I'm going to close that zipper up and press the lining back away from the zipper. And that's what I have on the inside and the outside. There's that top stitching. So let's go over and attach the other panels. Before we attach these panels to the zipper, we need to place our D-ring connectors against the back panel according to the pattern directions. I'm going to do that real quick and baste them in place, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I've basted those in place according to the pattern directions, and now I'm going to take my other pieces that are already attached to the zipper. I'm going to flip it over so that they are right sides together. That's pretty side to pretty side. I'm going to line the mark that I made on my zipper up with that center seam on that exterior panel, and then I'm going to press my zipper in place. And do that along both sides. I like to start from the center and work my way out. Now I'm going to remove the adhesive backing from this piece and lay that face down over the other lining piece so that the zipper pocket is facing the slip pocket. And again, lining up that center mark, and then from the center out along the edge, making sure that it is nice and even. All right, now we're going back over to the machine and we're going to sew across this edge. So here's a little tip that I like to do for these strap connectors. I don't trim mine off, and I'm not sure if she's going to change that in the pattern or not. But what I like to do is come back and within the seam allowance, stitch again, catching both seam allowances and that strap connector. And that's not all I'm going to do to reinforce those strap connectors. So we're going to again top stitch through the exterior panel only, and that's going to include the lower side of the strap connector, because we're not going to be top stitching through our strap connector on the outside. Now there's a little bit of thickness right here that we have to deal with, but you got it. Go slow. If you're using a domestic machine, you may even have to hand crank, and that's perfectly all right. I actually do that sometimes with my Juki, just to make sure that I don't have to worry about any missed stitches or anything like that. So now I have that attached. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my lining. So I'm moving the exterior out of the way, and I'm folding my lining back against that tab, and I'm actually going to stitch that tab to my lining on both sides. So I'm just going to make sure that my lining is laying nice and smooth. Now, this is just an extra bit of precaution. It isn't a necessary step, but I just like to make sure that there's no chance my strap connectors are going to pop loose on my customer. So there's just a couple of lines of stitches on the inside of the bag that aren't even going to really be noticeable when the bag is together and complete. Nobody's going to be looking at those little stitches there. So this is where we're at, and we're ready to actually assemble the exterior of the bag. Okay, so we're ready to assemble the exterior of the bag. So we're going to flip it so that the exterior are right sides together and the lining is right sides together. Now, very important, the first thing we're going to do is line up these points on the side and put a clip. Making sure those seams are touching. And then again, the seam on the bottom. And then we can clip the rest of the way around. Paying attention to these side pieces. Now I'm going to press my zipper panel, and remember, I almost forgot, I'm going to reach through here. Unzip this zipper. It is very important that you unzip this zipper at least a part of the way so that we can turn it through. Otherwise, we're going to struggle a little bit. So now I'm going to push that zipper tab, sort of fold it in half toward the lining, and make sure that this spot is lined up as well on both sides. So you can see we've got a little bit of a pucker there, but that's okay. When we sew it, we're going to kind of ease that in. No issues on this side. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this. Normally, I would start with the lining panel. I would start next to my opening where my turn gap is going to be, and I would sew across and backstitch, then go all the way around the rest of the bag. But I'm going to do it according to the pattern instructions. If you notice when you attach the lining to the exterior panels, they are a little bit smaller, and that is on purpose. That's so you can use the same seam allowance for the entire thing. So it can be a little bit easier to just go ahead and do the exterior and box the corners, and then come back and clip your lining panel together and sew and box the corners that way. So I'm going to do it according to the pattern directions, and we're going to go over and stitch the exterior together at this point. So I'm going to start on the side that is closest to my needle. And I'm going to remove that clip, make sure that these are still lined up. I'm going to bring it over. I'm going to drop that needle down right into the seam where the lining and the exterior meet. Now I'm back stitching at the beginning and the end. So it's not hard to know where you're going to turn because your needle is going to be right in that center seam. Make sure that you're back stitching there. We're going to go across the bottom, back stitching at the beginning and the end. So I'm going to stop with my needle down, make sure everything is still lined up there. Go right up to that seam, back stitch, and that part is done. I'm going to box the corners. So one of the things that I find most important when boxing the corners, I'm actually going to reach up through here and get my hand inside. I want to spread open my seam allowance. It's not necessary to spread it open. You can go one way or the other. So if you're going to the left with the bottom seam, you want to go to the right with the side seam. And what makes it a lot easier if you just spread everything open and make sure that the side seam lines up with the bottom seam. That's going to give you a nice finish on the bag, and it's going to be evenly spaced. So you can press them like so, with one going one way and one going the other way, but I prefer to press them open. So I'm going to pop a clip right there. And then over here, and again over here, and this is just going to make sure that it stays open properly. I'm going to go ahead and clip the other side, and then we'll sew. Okay, I'm going to stitch across there and back stitch at the beginning and the end of this line of stitching. And then as an added bit of security, since this is the exterior of the bag, I like to do another line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the line that I just did. Now that has the corners boxed on the exterior portion, let's go over and get ready to sew together the lining part. So now we're ready to do the lining portion of our bag. I'm going to do it from this side. And one thing that I like to do is I can either use a particular color clip to mark where I want my opening to be, or I can use my chalk. So I'm just going to put a couple of lines right there, and that is going to be the size of my opening. I like to put my hand against it to make sure that my hand's going to fit in there easily. You don't want it to be the exact size of your hand. You want it to be a little bit larger because your hand has dimension. All right, so now we can get ready to clip all of this together, and it should clip very easily. It should line up nicely. One thing you can do if you're uncertain about where your stitch line should be is just put a horizontal line, or where you should turn, and when your needle hits that line, that's when you're going to turn. And you can measure that from the bottom or the top to make that mark. I just eyeball it. Here. There as well. And now I'm ready to sew. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. I'm going to go, and I'm starting with the correct seam allowance. I'm going to go down, back stitch there, and then I'm going to just sew there, then go across and go back up this side. So let's head over to the machine and do that. And now we're going to go ahead and box the corners on the lining panel. So this time we're going to have to reach in right here at the opening, our turn opening. It does make it a little bit easier because your hand is right there. And again, I'm going to line up this side seam with that bottom seam, even though there's not much of it there. I'm going to press the seam allowance open with my fingers. And I'm going to put a clip right there on that. Just like so. And do the same thing on the other side. So I'm just going to make sure that this is pulled open so that both sides are laying flat. And now I'm going to stitch right across that. Don't be afraid to mush your bag out of the way. You're not going to hurt it. And again, with the same seam allowance. And for the lining, I don't worry about a double row of stitching. All right, so the other side. Again, let's make sure that that is pulled out and laying flat. All right. Let's get over there to the counter and turn this bag out. So I have a couple of clips here ready to clip this bottom together once we have it turned. This bag is pretty easy to turn. I'm going to take my fingers in here and go ahead and push the zipper the rest of the way open. Just to clip these corners here so they're not poking out as much. Like so. You could trim a little bit of this if you wanted. but it's not really that big of a deal because they're fairly small seam allowances. So I'm going to push the bag through. I'm being pretty gentle with it. So I'm just going to take my time and just work around a little bit at a time. There we go. We have our lining pulled out. So now what I like to do is to put my hand back down into the bag and really push out all of my corners. And in this case, that means the ones on the side too. So push that out. Run my finger along those seams on the inside to make sure that they're nice and neat. And then while I have this out, I'm actually going to push with my thumb just to push that corner out so that we're separated from our zipper tab. I'm going to do that on both sides. Just like that. So I'm just using my thumb and putting a little bit of pressure right in the corner where that side seam is. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with my lining corners here because I'm going to need that to be nice and flush when I sew up this bottom. So what I like to do is come right over here where my stitching ends and pinch that up. I'm going to make sure that my edges are folded in the same on both sides. And I'm going to put a clip right on the area where that seam ends. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Matching up the edges of the seam. Oops. So I'm just finger pressing that seam so that it's turned in the correct amount. And then I'm going to clip that together, lining up those edges. And then once I have this clipped, I'm going to meet you over at the machine, and we're going to stitch at about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge. All right, so we're back over at the machine. I'm going to kind of press this flat. And I'm using a short stitch length for this, and I'm going to make sure that the edges of that material are lined up nicely. I'm going to drop my needle down right in, making sure that it's going through both layers. And I'm going to go pretty slow here because I want to make sure that those edges stay lined up nicely. I'm going to stop periodically with my needle down, make sure they're still lined up. So I don't know how close you can see, but on my machine, the gap where the feed dogs is at, the hole where the feed dogs come up, is 1/8 of an inch from where the needle goes down. So I am halfway between the needle and the feed dog gap with the edge of my material. So that's going to give me right at 1/16 of an inch, which is why I'm really diligent in making sure that my fabric stays lined up along the edge so that I can make sure that it is catching both layers of the fold. And this way, there's a minimal bump in the bottom of the bag where you've attached the two sides together. Back stitch. I'm going to clip that thread. Now you can see here that that is right on the edge of the material on both sides, and I did catch it all the way across. So I will probably heat set these threads when we get over to the counter, and we can stuff the lining in and see how we turned out. And there we go. Now I'll go back and steam this so that things are laying nicely. The only thing left to do is my strap. So I have my connectors there. And if I decide to make a tassel, so there's the back of the bag. Of course, it still needs a little bit of steam. So let's get the strap put together real quick. I'm going to set that aside. Now, again, I am using webbing for my strap. You are more than welcome to use the pattern instructions and make your own strap, but I love this webbing. It's so nice. This is the seatbelt style webbing, and it's 1 inch wide, so I'll meet you over at the machine. Okay, we are back over here at the machine, and I have all my hardware here. So I have 2 of my swivel clasps here, and you can get these in my online shop. I have them in 1 inch and 1/2 inch, and I'm just using a standard tri-glide for this. So I've already heat sealed the ends of my strap, so I don't have to worry about that, but I am going to fold them under just so that those raw ends are still not exposed. So the first thing I'm going to do is attach it to my tri-glide. So I'm going in one side and out the other, and then I'm going to loop it around that center post and go through the other side. So I'm giving myself approximately 2.5 inches here to work with, and I'm going to fold it back under about 1 inch. So I'm just going to make sure that is nicely lined up, and then I'm going to sew a box around it. I like to go ahead and snip my thread ends. I'm going to turn and go back down across the center of the box and end where the corner of the box is. I'm going to go back across the bottom. And then I'm going to turn and go back up across the center to the opposite corner. Backstitch, and that is done there. And I'll show you that in just a second. So you have a square with an X across it. You can see a little bit better on the back side because I still have that dark gray thread there. Okay, so now at this point, go over to the counter so you can see this a little bit better. All right, so we've attached our tri-glide to our strap. And at this point, we want to make sure that this stays nice and straight, like so. So I'm going to lay this here with the back side facing me, or facing up. And I'm going to feed my swivel clasp onto this, so you can see everything is still straight. And now I'm going to go back up through this side. And then down through the other side. Like so. So this is what we have for the front side of our strap. Now for this side, this is the front, the side that you can see the buckle on, not the side where the square is showing. So I want to make sure that I'm feeding my next swivel clasp on so that the clasp is on the same side as the buckle. So now I'm going to fold this down about 1 inch and line that up on there. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side that I did on the other side. And this is going to be the back side facing down. So let's go over and sew that. Alright, I'm just going to trim my threads. And we're all done. So I'm going to add this to the bag and give you the full look. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed this video and that the tutorial helped you. If you needed any help making the bag with this pattern, all of the steps here will transfer to the two smaller versions of the bag. Again, the only difference with this one is that it doesn't have the larger D-rings. It has one D-ring on the side. I will say that this is on the wrong side because I got in a hurry because I was excited. So you would want your D-ring on the same side as your zipper pull when it's closed. And it also has a wristlet that goes with it. And then, of course, the smaller version, which I have added the key fob to. So again, the link for this pattern is in the description box below, as well as some of my favorite tools. There are some affiliate links down there for Amazon. And yeah, I will see you all next time. Have a great day. Bye. And I like to put my hand against it. And there goes my bobbin. I did not win this instance of bobbin chicken.